The crystal chandeliers cast their golden light across the marble floors of the Blackwood Mansion's grand ballroom, where the city's most influential figures had gathered for what was supposed to be a charitable fundraising gala. However, the evening had devolved into something far more sinister, a display of intellectual arrogance and social cruelty that would soon backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. Richard Blackwood III, heir to a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire, stood at the center of the room like a peacock displaying his feathers. At 35, he had never worked a day in his life. Having inherited his wealth from a grandfather who had built the family fortune through questionable business practices in the early 1900s, Richard's entire identity was built around his supposed intellectual superiority, which he believed came naturally with his privileged bloodline. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. "I've been thinking about the state of education in our society, and frankly, I'm appalled by how little the working class understands about the world they live in." The room fell silent as the guest politicians, business leaders, and socialites turned their attention to their host. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Richard was about to cross a line that even their privileged circle found distasteful. "Take my household staff, for example," Richard continued, gesturing dismissively toward the uniformed servers who were quietly refilling champagne glasses around the room. "These people work in my home every day, surrounded by culture, art, and intelligent conversation, yet they remain completely ignorant of the most basic concepts that govern our society." Margaret Chen, a 52-year-old woman who had been working as the head housekeeper at the Blackwood Mansion for the past 8 years, continued her duties with the practiced invisibility that domestic workers had perfected over generations. She moved silently between the guests, ensuring their glasses remained full while her mind processed every word of her employer's increasingly offensive monologue. Margaret had learned long ago to become invisible in plain sight. In her 8 years of service, she had witnessed countless displays of arrogance, ignorance, and casual cruelty from Richard and his circle of friends. She had seen business deals that destroyed communities, heard conversations about tax evasion schemes that robbed public services of funding, and observed the casual dismissal of human suffering that seemed to be a prerequisite for membership in this social stratum. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Richard seemed determined to push his cruelty to new heights, and Margaret could sense that something was building toward a confrontation that would change everything. "I propose a little experiment," Richard announced, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "Let's test the intellectual capacity of the help, shall we?" Several guests laughed nervously, while others looked genuinely uncomfortable. Senator Patricia Williams, a woman who had built her political career on advocating for working families, started to speak up. "Richard, I don't think this is— "Oh, come now, Patricia," Richard interrupted with a wave of his hand. "It's all in good fun. Besides, if these people are as intelligent as the liberals claim, they should welcome the opportunity to prove it." Richard's gaze swept across the room until it landed on Margaret, who was refilling the champagne glass of Judge Harrison, one of the city's most respected legal minds. "You there?" Richard called out, pointing directly at Margaret, the Asian woman with the tray. Margaret's hand tightened imperceptibly on the champagne bottle, but her expression remained neutral. She had faced racism and classism her entire life, and she had learned to armor herself against both. "Yes, sir," she replied in the respectful tone that her position demanded. "What's your name?" Richard asked, though he had been introduced to Margaret countless times over the years. "Margaret Chen, sir." "Well, Margaret Chen," Richard said, drawing out her name with exaggerated pronunciation. "I'm curious about your educational background. Did you finish high school?" The room had gone completely silent now. Even the other staff members had stopped their work to watch the scene unfold. Margaret could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some filled with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with barely concealed disgust at Richard's behavior. "Yes, sir, I did," Margaret replied calmly. "Wonderful," Richard exclaimed with mock enthusiasm. "And I suppose you think that makes you qualified to understand the complex legal and economic systems that govern our society." Margaret remained silent, recognizing the trap that was being laid for her. Any response would be twisted to serve Richard's narrative. "I'll tell you what," Richard continued, his voice growing louder as he warmed to his performance. "I'm going to give you a little test, something that even my lawyer friends here might find challenging." Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. As one of the most respected jurists in the state, he had seen enough courtroom drama to recognize when someone was about to make a catastrophic mistake. "Richard," he said quietly, "perhaps we should—" "Nonsense," Richard interrupted. "This will be educational for everyone." Richard walked over to his massive mahogany desk, which dominated one corner of the ballroom, and retrieved a thick leather-bound book. The tome was clearly old and expensive, with gold lettering on its spine that read Constitutional Law, Advanced Principles, and Applications. "This book," Richard announced, holding it up for all to see, "contains some of the most complex legal concepts known to mankind, concepts that require years of study at the finest universities to understand." He opened the book to a seemingly random page and began to read. The Dormant Commerce Clause Doctrine, as established in the landmark case of Cooley v. Board of Wardens, creates a presumption against state regulations that discriminate against or unduly burden interstate commerce, while allowing for local regulations that address legitimate local concerns and do not significantly impact interstate commercial activity. Richard snapped the book shut with a theatrical flourish. There you have it, Margaret Chen, a fundamental principle of American constitutional law. Now, since you're clearly an educated woman who finished high school, surely you can explain to our distinguished guests exactly what the Dormant Commerce Clause means and why it's important. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stood there with a smug smile, clearly expecting Margaret to stammer out some inadequate response that would prove his point about the intellectual inferiority of the working class. What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Margaret Chen had not always been a housekeeper. Before, a series of personal tragedies had forced her to take whatever work she could find to support her family. Margaret had been Dr. Margaret Chen, a constitutional law professor at one of the nation's most prestigious universities. Margaret had earned her undergraduate degree summa cum laude from Harvard, followed by a law degree from Yale, where she had graduated first in her class. She had clerked for a Supreme Court justice, worked for a top-tier law firm, and eventually became one of the youngest tenured professors in her university's history. But life had a way of humbling even the most accomplished individuals. When her husband was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at the age of 45, Margaret had faced a choice: continue her academic career while watching the love of her life slowly disappear, or sacrifice everything to care for him and their teenage daughter. She had chosen love and family over career, using her savings to pay for experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. When those savings ran out, she had sold their house, their cars, and everything else of value. When her husband finally passed away 3 years ago, Margaret had been left with nothing but debt and a daughter who needed support through college. The Blackwood mansion had been the only job she could find that paid enough to cover her daughter's tuition at medical school. For 8 years, she had endured Richard's condescension, his casual racism, and his complete ignorance of the fact that the woman cleaning his toilets was more educated than he would ever be. But tonight, something inside Margaret snapped. Perhaps it was the way Richard had deliberately humiliated her in front of all these people. Perhaps it was the years of accumulated frustration at being treated as invisible and worthless. Or perhaps it was simply time for the truth to come out. Margaret set down her champagne tray on a nearby table and looked directly at Richard for the first time in 8 years. When she spoke, her voice was clear, confident, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone who truly understood the subject at hand. The Dormant Commerce Clause, Margaret began, is not actually written in the Constitution. It's a judicial doctrine that the Supreme Court has inferred from the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8, which grants Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. Richard's smug expression began to falter as Margaret continued. The doctrine you mentioned from Cooley v. Board of Wardens, decided in 1851, established what we call the Selective Exclusiveness Doctrine. However, your citation is somewhat incomplete. The modern framework for Dormant Commerce Clause analysis was actually established much later, primarily through cases like Pike v. Bruce Church in 1970 and Philadelphia v. New Jersey in 1978. The room was absolutely silent now. Even the other staff members had stopped pretending to work and were staring at Margaret in amazement. The Pike balancing test, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, requires courts to weigh the burden on interstate commerce against the local benefits of the regulation. If the burden substantially outweighs the benefits, the regulation violates the Dormant Commerce Clause, even if it doesn't explicitly discriminate against out-of-state commerce. Richard's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Furthermore, Margaret said, now fully in her element, the doctrine has several important exceptions. The market participant exception, established in Hughes v. Alexandria Scrap Corp., allows states to favor their own citizens when they're acting as market participants rather than market regulators. The congressional authorization exception permits state regulations that would otherwise violate the Dormant Commerce Clause if Congress has explicitly authorized such regulations. Judge Harrison was now leaning forward in his chair, his eyes wide with amazement. As someone who dealt with constitutional law on a daily basis, he recognized that he was listening to an explanation that would have been impressive coming from a Supreme Court justice, let alone a housekeeper. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret continued, her gaze never leaving Richard's increasingly horrified face. The Dormant Commerce Clause reflects a fundamental principle of federalism, that we are one nation with one national economy, and that state parochialism cannot be allowed to fragment that economic union. Margaret paused for a moment, letting her words sink in before delivering what she knew would be the final blow. The case you cited, Mr. Blackwood, Cooley v. Board of wardens, was actually about pilotage regulations in Philadelphia's harbor. The court held that some subjects of interstate commerce require uniform national regulation, while others can be regulated by states until Congress acts. It's a foundational case, but your characterization of its holding was ... imprecise. Silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo through the room like thunder. Richard stood frozen, the expensive law book still clutched in his hands, his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. Senator Williams was the first to break the silence. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "I've heard constitutional law professors give less comprehensive explanations." "Because she is a constitutional law professor," Judge Harrison said quietly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Or rather, she was. You're Dr. Margaret Chen, aren't you? From Columbia University." Margaret nodded slowly. "I was, yes. Before, ... circumstances changed." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Dr. Margaret Chen had been a legend in legal, academic circles, a brilliant scholar, whose articles on constitutional interpretation had been cited by the Supreme Court itself. Her sudden disappearance from academia 8 years ago had been the subject of much speculation in legal circles. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You're a professor." "I was," Margaret replied simply. "Now I'm a housekeeper. Life has a way of humbling us all, Mr. Blackwood. The difference is that some of us learn from that humbling, while others never get the chance to experience it." The implications of what had just happened were sinking in throughout the room. Richard Blackwood, the man who had spent the evening mocking the intelligence of the working class, had just been intellectually demolished by the very person he had chosen to humiliate. But Margaret wasn't finished. 8 years of suppressed anger and frustration were finally finding their voice, and she had much more to say. The revelation that Margaret Chen was not just any housekeeper, but Dr. Margaret Chen, one of the most respected constitutional law scholars in the country, sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely, transforming from a scene of casual cruelty into something that felt more like a courtroom, where justice was finally being served. Richard Blackwood stood frozen in the center of the room, still clutching the law book that had been meant to be his weapon of humiliation. His face had cycled through several shades of red and was now settling into a sickly pale color that matched his suddenly trembling hands. For the first time in his privileged life, Richard was experiencing what it felt like to be completely and utterly outmatched. Judge Harrison rose from his chair, his expression a mixture of amazement and professional respect. "Dr. Chen," he said, "formerly I had the privilege of reading your law review article on the evolution of substantive due process. It was brilliant work." "Thank you, Your Honor," Margaret replied with a slight nod, her demeanor now completely transformed from the invisible servant she had been moments before to the confident academic she had once been. Senator Williams also stood, her political instincts immediately recognizing the significance of what was unfolding. "Dr. Chen, if I may ask, what brought you to ... this situation?" Margaret's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, the pain of the past 8 years flickered across her features. "My husband developed early-onset Alzheimer's when he was 45. I chose to care for him rather than pursue my career. When he passed away 3 years ago, I found myself in a position where I needed to support my daughter through medical school. This job provided the income and flexibility I needed." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with respect rather than anticipation. Several of the guests looked genuinely ashamed, realizing that they had been complicit in the humiliation of a woman who had sacrificed everything for love and family. But Richard, perhaps sensing that his social standing was crumbling around him, decided to double down on his arrogance. "Well," he said, his voice shaky but still attempting to maintain its condescending tone, "that's a very touching story, but it doesn't change the fact that you're currently employed as domestic help. Surely you can understand why I might have assumed." "Assumed what, exactly?" Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "That because I clean your house, I must be intellectually inferior? That because I'm Asian and work with my hands, I couldn't possibly understand complex legal concepts?" Richard's mouth opened and closed several times, but no coherent response emerged. "Let me tell you what I've learned in my 8 years of cleaning your house, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've learned that true ignorance isn't about lacking formal education, it's about having every opportunity to learn and choosing instead to remain willfully stupid." The guests were now completely transfixed. This was no longer just an embarrassing social moment, it was becoming a masterclass in intellectual and moral superiority. "For instance," Margaret said, beginning to pace slowly around the room like a professor delivering a lecture, "I've overheard your conversations about the tax shelters you used to avoid paying your fair share to the society that enabled your wealth. You seem to believe that your money makes you exempt from the social contract that binds the rest of us." Richard's face was now bright red again. "Now see here, I'm not finished." Margaret said firmly, and something in her tone made Richard immediately fall silent. I've also heard your discussions about the housing developments you're planning. Developments that will displace low-income families so you can build luxury condominiums for people like yourself. You speak about these families as if they're obstacles to be removed rather than human beings with rights and dignity. Senator Williams was now taking notes, her political mind already recognizing the potential implications of what she was hearing. But perhaps most disturbing, Margaret continued, are the conversations I've overheard about your plans to challenge the city's affordable housing ordinances in court. You seem to believe that your property rights are absolute, with no corresponding obligations to the community that provides the infrastructure, security, and educated workforce that makes your wealth possible. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Are you suggesting that Mr. Blackwood is planning to challenge the constitutionality of the city's affordable housing requirements? I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor, Margaret replied carefully. I'm simply noting that I've overheard discussions about hiring the law firm of Pemberton, Hayes and Associates to file such a challenge, based on a theory that the requirements constitute a regulatory taking under the Fifth Amendment. The judge's eyebrows rose significantly. Pemberton Hayes and Associates was known for representing wealthy developers in constitutional challenges to municipal regulations, and their involvement would indeed suggest a serious legal challenge was being planned. That's privileged information. Richard finally found his voice, though it cracked slightly as he spoke. You had no right to listen to my private conversations. Margaret turned to face him directly, her expression calm but her eyes blazing with controlled fury. Privileged information. Mr. Blackwood, you've had these conversations in your living room, your dining room, and your study while I was cleaning around you. You spoke about these matters as if I were a piece of furniture invisible and incapable of understanding what I was hearing? That's different, Richard protested weakly. Is it? Margaret asked. Because it seems to me that you've been discussing plans to deprive working families of affordable housing, while being served by a working woman who has been struggling to afford housing herself. The irony is almost poetic. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a prominent psychiatrist who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up for the first time. This is fascinating from a psychological perspective. Mr. Blackwood, you've essentially been living a real-life version of the Emperor's new clothes. Surrounded by people who could see your intellectual nakedness, but were prevented by social and economic power structures from pointing it out. I don't have to listen to this, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked around the room, clearly hoping for support from his guests, but found only faces filled with fascination, respect for Margaret, and in some cases, barely concealed disgust for his behavior. Actually, you do, Margaret said quietly, because for 8 years, I've had to listen to your ignorant opinions. Your casual racism, your complete disregard for the humanity of anyone who serves you. Tonight, you decided to make a public spectacle of what you believed was my ignorance. Turnabout, as they say, is fair play. Margaret walked over to Richard's desk and picked up another book, a volume on economic theory that Richard kept for show rather than substance. Since you seem to enjoy testing people's knowledge, perhaps you'd like to explain the concept of economic rent and its relationship to wealth inequality. Richard stared at the book as if it were a venomous snake. No, Margaret continued. How about the difference between positive and normative economics? Or perhaps you could discuss the implications of Piketty's research on capital accumulation and wealth concentration. The silence stretched on as Richard remained frozen, clearly having no idea how to respond to any of Margaret's questions. I thought not, Margaret said gently, setting the book back down. You see, Mr. Blackwood, the difference between us isn't that I'm smarter than you. Intelligence comes in many forms, and I'm sure you have talents that I lack. The difference is that I've actually studied these subjects, while you've simply assumed that your wealth makes you an expert on everything. Senator Williams stood up again, her expression now one of barely controlled anger. Mr. Blackwood, if what Dr. Chen has described is accurate, if you're planning to challenge affordable housing ordinances while publicly mocking the intelligence of working people, then I think the voters in this city deserve to know about it. Now wait just a minute, Richard began, but Judge Harrison cut him off. Dr. Chen, the judge said, I'm curious about your legal opinion on the constitutional issues surrounding affordable housing requirements. Do you believe they constitute regulatory takings? Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, and when she spoke, it was with the careful precision of a scholar addressing a complex legal question. The Supreme Court's decision in Penn Central Transportation, Co. v. New York City established a multi-factor test for determining when a regulation becomes a taking. The court looks at the economic impact of the regulation, the extent to which it interferes with investment-backed expectations, and the character of the government action. She paused, organizing her thoughts before continuing. Affordable housing requirements, when properly structured, typically survive this analysis because they serve compelling public interests, don't deny all economically viable use of the property, and are applied as part of a comprehensive regulatory scheme rather than targeting specific properties. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. That's an excellent analysis. And what about the argument that such requirements violate substantive due process by interfering with property rights? The court has consistently held that property rights are not absolute, Margaret replied. As Justice Holmes wrote in Pennsylvania, Cole, Co. v. Mahan, government hardly could go on, if to some extent values incident to property could not be diminished without paying for every such change in the general law. The key question is whether the regulation is rationally related to a legitimate government purpose, and affordable housing certainly serves legitimate government purposes, Senator Williams interjected. Promoting economic diversity, preventing segregation, ensuring that essential workers can afford to live in the communities they serve. Richard was now looking around the room desperately, clearly realizing that he had lost control of the situation entirely. His attempt to humiliate Margaret had backfired spectacularly, and now his own business practices were being scrutinized by some of the most powerful people in the city. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "I'm being attacked. In my own home by my own employee." "Former employee," Margaret said quietly. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard stared at her, his mouth agape. "I quit, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret continued, her voice steady and calm. "Effective. Immediately. I've tolerated your condescension, your racism, and your complete lack of basic human decency for 8 years because I needed this job. But tonight, you've shown me something I should have realized long ago, that no amount of money is worth sacrificing your dignity." Margaret began removing her apron as she spoke, folding it neatly and placing it on a nearby table. "I've saved enough money to support my daughter through the rest of medical school, and I've recently been offered a position at the Public Interest Law Clinic downtown. It doesn't pay as much as cleaning your house, but it allows me to use my education to help people who actually need it." The transformation was remarkable. As Margaret removed the symbols of her servitude, she seemed to grow taller, more confident, more like the respected academic she had once been. The other staff members watched in amazement, as one of their own stood up to the man who had treated them all as invisible for so long. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "I think the people of this city deserve to know what kind of man they're dealing with. Your plans to challenge affordable housing ordinances, your tax avoidance schemes, your complete disregard for the working families whose labor makes your lifestyle possible, all of it should be public knowledge." Richard's face had gone from red to white to a sickly green color. "You can't do that," he whispered. "It would ruin me." "No, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret replied with a slight smile. "You've ruined yourself. I'm simply going to make sure that everyone knows about it." The aftermath of Margaret's revelation and resignation created a ripple effect that would transform not only her own life, but the entire social and political landscape of the city. As word spread about what had transpired at the Blackwood mansion that evening, the story took on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of the hidden intelligence and dignity of working people everywhere. Within hours of the gala's end, Senator Williams had called an emergency meeting with her staff to discuss the implications of what she had witnessed. The senator, who had built her career on advocating for working families, recognized that Margaret's story represented something much larger than a single incident of workplace humiliation. "We need to get Dr. Chen's story out there, Senator," Williams told her communications director. "But more importantly, we need to investigate these allegations about Blackwood's business practices. If he's really planning to challenge affordable housing ordinances while publicly mocking working people, the voters deserve to know." Meanwhile, Judge Harrison had spent the night researching Margaret's academic background, confirming what he had suspected during their conversation. Dr. Margaret Chen had indeed been one of the most respected constitutional law scholars in the country before her disappearance from academia. Her articles had been cited in numerous Supreme Court decisions, and her textbook on constitutional interpretation was still used in law schools across the nation. The judge made a decision that would prove crucial to Margaret's future. He called the dean of the city's law school, Dr. Robert Martinez, whom he had known for decades. "Bob," Judge Harrison said over the phone, "I need to tell you about something extraordinary that happened last night, and I think you're going to want to offer someone a job." Dr. Martinez listened in amazement as the judge recounted the events at the Blackwood mansion. By the end of the conversation, he was already mentally drafting a job offer for Margaret. Constitutional law scholars of her caliber don't come along very often. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Among the guests at the gala had been investigative journalist Sarah Thompson, who worked for the city's largest newspaper. Sarah had been quietly taking notes throughout Margaret's impromptu lecture, recognizing that she was witnessing a story that could have major implications for the city's political landscape. Sarah spent the next 3 days conducting intensive research into Richard Blackwood's business practices. Using the information Margaret had provided as a starting point, what she discovered was even worse than Margaret had suggested. Richard's company had indeed been planning to challenge the city's affordable housing ordinances, but that was just the beginning. Sarah's investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that included tax evasion, illegal campaign contributions, and a systematic effort to displace low-income residents from valuable urban land. The story broke on the front page of the Sunday edition, under the headline, "The Housekeeper Who Knew Too Much: How a Constitutional Law Scholar Exposed a Millionaire's Corruption." The article detailed not only the events at the gala, but also the extensive evidence of Richard's illegal and unethical business practices. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Within hours of the story's publication, protesters had gathered outside the Blackwood mansion, demanding accountability. Social media exploded with support for Margaret and condemnation of Richard's behavior. The hashtag #HousekeeperJustice began trending nationally, with people sharing their own stories of workplace humiliation and hidden talents. But perhaps the most powerful response came from Margaret's former colleagues in academia. Constitutional law professors from universities across the country began reaching out, offering support and expressing their admiration for her sacrifice and courage. Many admitted that they had wondered what had happened to the brilliant scholar who had simply vanished from their field 8 years earlier. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's former colleague at Columbia University, published an op-ed in a major legal journal titled "The Hidden Costs of Academic Excellence: Why We Lost Dr. Margaret Chen." The article detailed the impossible choices that many academics, particularly women, faced when family crises struck, and called for systemic changes to support scholars through difficult times. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood's world was collapsing. Around him, the revelation of his planned legal challenges to affordable housing ordinances had prompted the city council to launch an investigation into his business practices. The IRS announced that they would be auditing his tax returns for the past 7 years. Several of his business partners began distancing themselves from him, and his company's stock price plummeted. But the most devastating blow came when Richard's own employees began speaking out. Inspired by Margaret's courage, several of his domestic staff members came forward with their own stories of humiliation and abuse. The picture that emerged was of a man who had systematically dehumanized everyone who worked for him, treating them as objects rather than people. Maria Gonzalez, who had worked as Richard's cook for 5 years, told reporters he would have dinner parties where he would make jokes about us right in front of us, as if we couldn't understand English. He called us the help and treated us like we were invisible. Dr. Chen was the only one who ever stood up to him. The legal consequences for Richard were swift and severe. The district attorney announced that his office would be investigating potential criminal charges related to tax evasion and campaign finance violations. The city's ethics commission launched its own investigation into Richard's business practices and their impact on affordable housing in the city. But for Margaret, the aftermath of that evening brought opportunities she had never expected. The job offer from the law school came within a week, along with offers from several other prestigious institutions. The Public Interest Law Clinic, where she had been planning to work, offered her a position as their director, with a salary that would allow her to rebuild her financial security while doing meaningful work. Most importantly, Margaret's daughter called her from medical school, having seen the news coverage of her mother's confrontation with Richard. "Mom," her daughter said through tears, "I always knew you were brilliant, but I never realized how much you had sacrificed for me. I'm so proud of you for standing up to that horrible man." "I should have done it years ago," Margaret replied, "but I was afraid of losing the income we needed for your education." "Well, you don't have to worry about that anymore," her daughter said. "I've been offered a full scholarship for my remaining 2 years, and 3 different hospitals have already offered me residency positions. Your story has inspired so many people. Mom, you've shown the world that intelligence and dignity aren't determined by job titles or bank accounts." Margaret decided to accept the position at the law school. Returning to the academic world she had left 8 years earlier, her first lecture on the constitutional principles underlying affordable housing law was standing room only, with students, faculty, and members of the public all eager to hear from the woman who had become a symbol of hidden brilliance and quiet dignity. "The law," Margaret told her audience, "is not an abstract concept that exists only in courtrooms and law libraries. It lives in our communities, in our workplaces, and in our daily interactions with one another. Every person in this room, regardless of their job title, their income, or their educational background, is both subject to the law and entitled to its protection." She paused, looking out at the diverse audience that filled the lecture hall. "For 8 years, I cleaned the house of a man who believed that his wealth made him superior to everyone around him. He was wrong. Wealth can buy many things, but it cannot buy wisdom, compassion, or true intelligence. Those qualities are found in people from all walks of life, in housekeepers and professors, in construction workers and senators, in anyone who approaches the world with curiosity, empathy, and respect for others." The applause that followed was thunderous and sustained, lasting for several minutes as the audience rose to their feet in recognition of Margaret's journey and her message. 6 months later, Richard Blackwood was convicted on multiple counts of tax evasion and campaign finance violations. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and ordered to pay millions of dollars in fines and back taxes. His real estate empire collapsed, and many of his properties were seized by the government to satisfy his debts. In a final irony, several of those properties were converted into affordable housing units, fulfilling the very purpose that Richard had spent so much energy trying to prevent. Margaret, meanwhile, had not only returned to her academic career, but had become one of the most sought-after legal commentators in the country. Her expertise in constitutional law, combined with her unique perspective on class and workplace dynamics, made her a powerful voice for social justice. She established a scholarship fund for working adults who wanted to return to school, using her own story as an example of how life's circumstances could derail even the most promising careers, but how it was never too late to rebuild and redirect one's path. The Margaret Chen Foundation, as it came to be known, provided not just financial support but also mentoring and advocacy for people who had been overlooked or underestimated because of their circumstances. The foundation's motto, inspired by Margaret's confrontation with Richard, was simple but powerful: intelligence has no uniform. On the first anniversary of the infamous gala, Senator Williams organized a celebration honoring Margaret and the broader principle she had come to represent. The event was held not in a mansion or exclusive venue, but in the community center of a working-class neighborhood, surrounded by the people whose dignity and intelligence Margaret had defended. Dr. Chen, Senator Williams, said in her remarks, "You reminded us that night that true education isn't about the degrees on our walls or the titles on our business cards. It's about how we treat one another, how we recognize the humanity and potential in every person we meet, and how we use our knowledge and privilege to lift others up rather than tear them down." Margaret's response was characteristically humble and thoughtful. That night at the Blackwood mansion, she said, "I wasn't just defending myself. I was defending every person who has ever been dismissed because of their job, their accent, their appearance, or their circumstances. I was speaking for every brilliant mind that has been overlooked because it didn't come packaged in the way society expected." She looked out at the audience, which included former colleagues from academia, current students, community activists, and many of the domestic workers who had found their own voices in the aftermath of her confrontation with Richard. We live in a society that too often confuses wealth with worth, privilege with intelligence, and power with righteousness. But true wisdom comes from recognizing that every person has something valuable to contribute, and that our job as human beings is to create spaces where that contribution can be recognized and celebrated. The evening ended with Margaret announcing her latest project, a legal clinic that would provide free representation to domestic workers facing exploitation and abuse. The clinic would be staffed by law students and volunteer attorneys, but its guiding principles would come from Margaret's own experience of being invisible in plain sight. No one, Margaret declared, should have to choose between dignity and survival. No one should have to endure humiliation and silence because they need a job, and no one should ever again be able to treat another human being as invisible simply because they hold economic power over them. As the crowd dispersed that evening, many attendees reflected on how one moment of courage, one decision to speak truth to power, had created ripple effects that continued to transform lives and communities. Margaret's confrontation with Richard Blackwood had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would be felt for generations. The story became a modern parable about the dangers of arrogance and the power of hidden wisdom. It reminded people that intelligence and dignity exist in every corner of society, often in the most unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves and change the world. And in law schools across the country, Margaret's story became required reading, not just as an example of constitutional law principles, but as a reminder that the law exists to protect the dignity of all people, regardless of their station in life, their economic circumstances, or the assumptions others might make about their capabilities. The millionaire who had mocked the maids, knowledge had indeed left the entire room silent, but not in the way he had intended. Instead, his arrogance had created space for truth, justice, and the recognition of human dignity to flourish. And in that silence, a new understanding was born about the true nature of intelligence, respect, and the power of speaking truth to power. The end. Legal disclaimer. This story is entirely fictional and has been created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely coincidental.